So we can visualize these things. I really like this one for thinking about equity versus equality. So on the left, we see equality. Everyone gets the same thing. Everyone gets a box to stand on. But as you can see, not everyone is able to have the same opportunity to watch the baseball game. Versus the picture on the right, we see a really nice example of equity, where some people need 2 boxes to stand on, others don't need any boxes. So it really takes into account where people are starting from in order to give them access to the same opportunities. And we can think about inclusion and diversity. I like to think about it in terms of like planning a party. So if this is our planning party committee, all green people, they're wondering why they don't have any fresh ideas. If they're planning a party, who do you think is going to have fun at their party? Probably green people, as opposed to people who are purple. So when we have a diversity of people at the table planning something, we can ensure that that event, that party, is going to be really inclusive for a lot of different people. So we can think again in terms of this party metaphor. Diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being asked to help plan the party. And so I like to think about outdoor recreation and public land management as a party because it's pretty fun. And thinking about inclusion in terms of how can we get more people not only being invited into these spaces, but helping to create them. So looking at DEI in outdoor recreation, generally speaking, this data comes from the Outdoor Foundation, and it's mostly focused on the United States. And this looks at participation in outdoor recreation in 2021. So what we see is roughly a 50-50 split of, in terms of sex, male, female, with males occupying a slight majority than over females. Age, we can see, is relatively well divided among different age groups in terms of participation. When we look at ethnicity, though, we see some really large overrepresentation and large significant underrepresentation. So 72% of the people who participated in outdoor recreation in 2021 identified as white. And this disparity in terms of white versus other cultural, racial, ethnic demographics is pervasive throughout our public lands and outdoor recreation participation. In fact, when we look at statistics on visitor demographics of national forests or national parks, we see that sometimes that number is 80 to 90% white. If you look at the pie chart to the right, this looks at percent of outdoor rec participants in 2020 versus 2015. And what we see here is that for African Americans, Asians, and Pacific Islanders, their participation in outdoor recreation did not increase in those 5 years. What we do see is that Latinos are the fastest growing group of participants in outdoor recreation, bumping up 3% and now occupy 11% of outdoor recreationists in 2020. Back to the graph on the right, or on the left, excuse me, we can see that people with higher educations participate in outdoor recreation much more frequently than those with lower education. So people with at least a college graduate degree occupy 40% of outdoor recreationists. And that bumps up to 60% in terms of people who've had 1 to 3 years of college education. And then when we look at income, it's also really startling. Look, 32% of outdoor recreationists last year make over $100,000. That's 46% make at least $75,000, and 64% make at least $50,000. And so when we take a moment in a few slides to look at the Crown in particular, that's significantly higher income than most people make who are residents of the Crown. So there has been a huge movement for increasing DEI in the outdoors. Recently in the United States, there's been a movement to increase DEI in more than just the outdoor world, but in many different aspects of our society. And that's really come down from the top in terms of executive orders. But there's been a real grassroots movement to increase DEI in the outdoors for many years now. And we can see a lot of this movement happening via social media. So there are individual influencers, there's a proliferation of nonprofit organizations, of affinity groups and interest groups that create presences on social media platforms like Instagram to advocate for more inclusive and equitable, accessible recreation. And I want to highlight this one here. This is called Inclusive Guide. It's a nonprofit. It's very new. It's a couple months old. An Inclusive Guide is a crowdsourced platform and organization that disperses information about tourism, travel, what places are friendly for these underrepresented communities, in terms of like restaurants, clothing stores, outdoor areas, protected areas, communities, and what areas should be avoided. And this is based off of the Negro Motorist Green Book, which was created during the Jim Crow era in the United States. So we see there were 4 different volumes, and the Negro Motorist Green Book was created by African Americans to advise travel so that people knew where to go, where they would be safe, where they would be accepted, and where they could find community. And so the Inclusive Guide really thinks of themselves as a new and more modern Negro Motorist Green Book. And it's really important. I know as recreation managers, we don't control the communities surrounding our areas or our gateway communities, but these areas are really important for drawing in, especially people of color. A huge constraint to outdoor recreation and visiting national parks and forests is having to go through very rural, isolated communities where you are very much in the minority. I've had friends visit the Crown who are African American, who've been stopped frequently by police officers on their way. One in particular worked in Yellowstone and was stopped 3 times when he came up to visit me in Glacier. And so those experiences kind of inform the social knowledge in these groups. And so it's really important that we have a very inclusive and accepting community, as well as the experiences that are happening on our public lands. In the outdoors, we really value diversity in terms of wildlife, in terms of plant communities, and the Crown is an incredibly diverse ecosystem, which is one of the things that brings us all together and is so special about it. We have endemic species, we have species that are endangered or threatened, and they all find a home here. We have all of our native predators and our megafauna species. And so we really value diversity when it comes to these landscapes. But we often find ourselves struggling to verbalize why we need diversity in the people who are on those landscapes as well. So looking at the Crown in particular, we can look at the demographics of residents in Northwest Montana, Alberta, and BC. And what we see is that they aren't representing the same kind of diversity, at least ethnically and racially, that we see in our ecosystem, our non-human neighbors. So if we look at race and ethnicity in the Flathead, Glacier, and Lake counties in Montana, you see that they are predominantly white. The next largest racial and ethnic group are Indigenous communities. followed by people who identify as 2 or more races, and then Latinos, but dominantly white. And that reflects the state of Montana as well. There are other aspects of diversity in these areas. This is a neat website called Census Reporter. It uses census data, and you can search by county or by region. So what we're looking at here is Lincoln County, Flathead County, and Glacier County. And it can tell you demographics like median age, race. We see 86% of people in these counties are white, 8% Native. Per capita income, so $57,458 per household. That's at the very bottom of that income threshold of the majority of outdoor recreationists. And per capita, nearly $30,000. So thinking about where we stand compared to global trends or national trends. And it'll be really interesting to see how income and education diversity in these areas change over the next several years, especially as we have a lot of new residents who are able to remote work coming. When we look at demographics of Alberta, we see that it is growing, adding over 1.9 million people by 2046. The pie chart in the middle is a breakdown in terms of race and ethnicity. It's similar to Northwest Montana, with a majority, 70% are European Canadian. Visible minorities make up about 24%, and that includes a plethora of identities from Chinese, Black, Filipino, Latin American, Arab, Korean, and then First Nations is about 3.5%, and Métis is almost 3%. So very similar. And a lot of the diversity, especially of these, visible minority groups, are more located in urban areas. And so within the Crown, we're occupying a lot more rural areas. As far as our visitorship, there's not very much research including visitor demographics beyond resident status in the Crown. So being a resident or non-resident, there's some information about income as well, but lacking research on education and on race and ethnicity. In a recent study out of the Institute for Tourism and Recreation Research at the University of Montana, there was a non-resident survey, and respondents were largely 65 and older, had at least a 4-year college degree, had income greater than $75,000 a year, and were overwhelmingly white, 96% of them. And when we look at ITRR data on Glacier Country visitors, this is very reflective of who comes from out of state to visit us. And so what efforts are currently underway to increase diversity, and how can we think about improving? So I really think about diversity as an outcome of intention. You need to intentionally invite people to your party, right? You need to reach out. And so that requires supporting our partners, that requires creating new partnerships. And there's a lot of exciting things that are currently happening. So Latino Outdoors is a really cool organization serving Latinos, but anyone of any identity, and introducing folks to spending time together in the outdoors in a way that both celebrates nature and culture. And so there's a new chapter in Missoula. There's rumblings of a chapter starting in Bozeman. We have robust Indigenous tourism opportunities across the Crown. So really prioritizing, investing, and engaging with those opportunities for Indigenous tourism. A a very cool story from the Crown in terms of a trip from the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation. Last year, they partnered with a group called Here Montana, which is based in Missoula and serves BIPOC folks interested in outdoor recreation. So Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation partnered with Here Montana to create a Wilderness 101 group trip. And that brought folks out into the Bob. They were packed in and learned how to set up tents, learned how to backpack, were introduced to a variety of different research projects going on out in the Bob, and created a really safe space for people to learn together and not feel like they were holding anyone else back, and that they could kind of come together and learn about wilderness recreation and conservation on their own terms. And a very cool outcome is, you know, they were intentionally invited to the party. And now Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation has hired 2 of the people who were on that trip as their wilderness trip leader interns for this coming season in 2022. So now, after being invited to the party, they're helping to plan the party, which is what we really want to see happen in the Crown. So very exciting. What else can we do? We really need to invest in our local partners, do research, find out what's going on, show up and support their opportunities. So like this workshop for Blackfoot entrepreneurs and tourism, reaching out, how can we help? Can we come? And supporting in that way, showing up at In Need days. There are also opportunities listed on, this is a very cool website as well. NativeAmerica.travel looks at tourism opportunities that are Indigenous led, and it's across the United States. And you can look at it regionally. So here's the Rocky Mountains, and we can see very cool experiences that are offered in CSKT and Blackfeet Nation. And so you can direct visitors who are interested to be guided on hunting trips or fishing trips that are Indigenous led. And that really supports our Indigenous partners and provides a new way and a new perspective to engage with this space. Lastly, we can work on creating new partnerships. There are a number of organizations working on DEI in the outdoors. So the Montana Racial Equity Project, Latino Outdoors, and Here Montana, and reaching out to provide our services and skills as Crown managers to partner and share. And these organizations can share with us their perspectives, their skills, and their community. So with that, thank you so much. Here's my contact information if you have any questions. I know that that was pretty quick and a high overview of some of these concepts. I'm not sure if we have questions or time for questions moving forward.
Great job, Jaclyn. That was awesome. I really enjoyed that presentation today. I'm sure others did as well. We have maybe a couple minutes for questions. So maybe we can just take 2 questions. I think there was one in the chat, but you addressed it on one of your slides. And then there's some other comments in the chat. So we can open it up for some verbal questions if anybody wants to ask a question to Jaclyn. Lots to percolate, lots to think through. Some great comments coming in.
Yeah,
some great links. Oh, yeah, sorry, Sarah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to slam my door. I wasn't
trying I didn't even see that. I'm busy reading the chat.
Thank you so much, Jaclyn. That was a really great presentation. I'm just wondering, like in the Alberta chapter of the Wildlife Society, we are working right now to try to put some energy into diversifying our profession as wildlife scientists and managers. And I appreciate that people who might be attracted to work with wildlife or with landscapes probably start with some appreciation of the outdoors through recreational activities. But I'm really struggling to link this gap of like, I love playing outside to I want to work with wildlife and habitats and landscapes. And I just wondered if in your basically in your literature review or in your work, if you've come across any research that kind of links these ideas or provides suggestions of what some of the barriers might be between I love the outdoors to I want to work in the outdoors.
Yeah, that's a great question. We do see a lot of interest, right? As we become more attached to places, as we become more attached to our outdoor activities, wanting to engage in that more professionally, or in terms of just wanting to participate in conservation of those places. When it comes to work, it's honestly very similar to the issues we run into with diversity in STEM education in terms of being able to afford going to school and prioritize that. So through scholarships, I think for wildlife programs that really focuses on our communities that we want to reach out to. So Indigenous communities, especially other BIPOC communities. Additionally, you know, especially in the federal world, there's so much bureaucracy in terms of hiring and navigating USA jobs. And so being able to reach into these communities and provide workshops in terms of how do we apply for a job on USA jobs, tips and tricks, and just, you know, very, very intentional hiring. The way that you post your jobs, the materials that you require from folks might not be culturally salient for all communities. And so kind of reframing and having a lens of what's being presented in the application materials of these communities that we want to reach out to more and include more, and maybe giving them a different understanding in terms of what they're providing, because what they're providing might be different than what we value as like a dominant white culture. And so it's going to take a lot of intentional outreach and communication.
Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Jaclyn. We have time just for one more question, so I'm going to go to Amanda.
Hi, thanks. Great presentation, Jaclyn. You spoke a bit to at the end about Indigenous tourism opportunities and some of the BIPOC groups that are forming outdoor groups to better access recreation. Can you speak at all to any way to connect those two, like so that the Indigenous tourism could provide those cultural groups their lens on accessing outdoor recreation, or those opportunities could be provided through Indigenous tourism groups?
Certainly, and that's like really exciting to think about. I think that, again, a lot of this is built through our communities and our connections and our partnerships. And so as Crown managers, kind of, like other tourists, and maybe perhaps easier than recommending to tourists, establishing partnerships with these emergent organizations, or some of them are much more established too. So partnering with these organizations and saying, hey, like there's these amazing tourism opportunities, or opportunities to go out and hike in the Sweetgrass Hills with a Blackfeet guide. Can I connect you? And so helping to build those bridges is something that we can do.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.